Welcome to the Red Light Exposé podcast.
We are an international grassroots survivor-led circle.
Our goal is to counter the growing acceptance of sex work ideology.
We aim to raise awareness of the harms of commercializing sex,
meaning prostitution, porn, stripping, and BDSM.
Through honest, in-depth conversations,
we elevate voices often ignored and silenced.
Together, we're challenging stereotypes and dismantling myths.
We envision a healthier, safer society, especially for women and girls.
We appreciate your company on this journey. Welcome back to Red Light Exposé podcast. This episode is part of our Men for Equality series, where we highlight the voices of 8 men who are doing important work that supports the movement to end commercial sexual exploitation. These men are survivor activists, policy advisors, and passionate changemakers. Red Light Exposé thanks Empower Men for their generosity in helping to make this series possible. You can check out and support the great work they are doing on their website, empowermen.ca. And now to the episode.
Hi, welcome to Red Light Exposé. My name's Sabrinna and I'm your host. I am an activist for the Nordic model across the world, and I have a strong interest in this because I experienced different models in different countries. So today I'm going to be talking with Dr. Michael Flood, who is a professor at the Queensland University of Technology. He is an internationally recognized researcher on men, masculinities, and violence prevention. Professor Flood has published widely on topics including violence against women and violence prevention, men and masculinities, pro-feminist men's advocacy, male heterosexuality, fathering, and pornography. His most recent book, published in August 2022, Masculinity and Violent Extremism, explores men's attraction to violent extremist movements and terrorism and the centrality of masculinity in violent extremist recruitment narratives across the religious and political spectrum. Today, we'll be talking about masculinities, boys, men, the online world, and how masculinities both impact and are impacted by the sex trade, which itself has become extremist. Dr. Michael Flood, welcome to Red Light Exposé. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
So it's a big topic, and when I've asked men to define what masculinity is, quite often I get definitions that are, it's not girls, it's not femininity, it's not what women do or what women like doing. And almost everything is a play off of femininity. We've sort of noticed this when it comes to baby names. When girls start taking on boys' names, boys stop using them. The reverse isn't true. When boys start taking on girls' names, they just don't do it. It's like it goes in one direction. So it seems to me that much of masculinity is defined by not femininity. So is that a fair assessment? And if so, why do many people seem to struggle defining masculinity in and of itself without comparison?
It's absolutely a fair assessment. And yeah, for a long time, I think masculinity has been defined in terms of being not feminine. And it's not simply about difference. It's also about hierarchy. If we look at gender norms and gender roles, then what's very clear is that in fact there is a privileging of masculinity, and for a man to be perceived as feminine, that is subordinating or makes that man inferior. And you can see that in the way that terms to do with girls and women or femininity are used as terms of abuse, used as ways to police boys and men's appropriate expressions of masculinity. To go back to definitions, in a simple sense, masculinity simply means the behaviors and the activities, the qualities that are expected of men and boys, the qualities that are seen as appropriate for men and boys. But in most contexts, they're strongly defined in terms of being not feminine. And in many contexts, the kind of dominant culture or society privileges qualities stereotypically associated with men and masculinity over the qualities stereotypically associated with women and girls and femininity. And you talked about movements in relation to girls' and boys' names, for example. We have seen in countries like Australia and other Western countries an overall progress towards gender equality to some extent over the last 30 or 40 years because of feminism, because of the women's movements. We've seen women's entry into various forms of paid work. We've seen women's greater presence in political leadership. We've seen some challenge to men's violence against women and so on. But one thing that's not changed, I think, still is that stigma of femininity. You see girls and women wearing pants. You don't see boys and men wearing dresses in their everyday lives. You see women moving into stereotypically masculine occupations to some extent, into the corporate world or into mining and so on, although that's also resisted. But you don't see many men moving into stereotypically feminine occupations like nursing or primary school teaching and so on. So essentially, a kind of sexist or patriarchal structuring of gender still shapes very strongly the meanings we give to masculinity and femininity.
Yeah, so it's a kind of rejection of women and girls in a sense to move away from femininity and sort of have a stark defining, this is not us, this is what we are.
I mean, I think there's been some productive blurring of gender boundaries in some way. I've paid attention to kind of dominant definitions of masculinity, and certainly over the last decade or two, there's been a weakening of the idea that men have to always be the dominant ones in relationships and families. There's been a weakening of the idea that men have to be rigidly heterosexual. There's been a blurring of the boundary between straight and gay and so on. But there still is a kind of rigid policing of masculinity in various ways, particularly by other men and boys. And as I've said, that plays out in efforts to kind of shame men and boys, to describe them as somehow feminized or homosexualized if they're not performing masculinity appropriately.
I was talking to a friend, it's somebody I've known for a long time, and he grew up in a really small town where boys would rally together around sport. That was how they found belonging in place. And he said, it was such a strong sense of identity for him and a sense of belonging that it gave him the strength to be able to really find himself. And he had this incredibly positive experience of then being able to go into the theatre and arts and exploring the feminine, which is quite an ironic offshoot from it. But he said he found out that when it's game night, no matter whether the home team wins or loses, domestic violence just skyrockets. And when he found that out, this sense of guilt kind of accompanied enjoyment of sport and the sense of belonging that he got from it. And so I'm wondering, where's the baby and where's the bathwater? How can we look at the positive aspects of sport, especially for young boys and men, while at the same time protecting women and acknowledging that there's this testosterone fueled violence that accompanies it from some sector?
Sport can be good or bad. And, I think most people would accept that sport can be a very positive space for, physical activity and health, for connecting with friends, for a sense of collective striving and so on. And, it's been really interesting to see the growing move of girls and women into sport and the growing popularity, for example, of women's soccer. I think the Matildas match a few years back was the most watched sporting event in Australian history. Likewise, the AFLW is now, kind of well-regarded sporting competition, the women's AFL competition. At the same time, it's also well documented that sport can be a site of deeply sexist and violent supportive cultures. And there's some evidence, mainly from the US, not from Australia. It's not been done. We've not done the research here, but evidence from the US that men who are participants, particularly in team-based contact sports, sports like American football, like ice hockey and so on, are more likely to be perpetrators of physical and sexual violence against women than men who are in other kinds of sport or not in sport altogether. So that is, there's some kinds of sporting participation that actually seem to be a risk factor for violence, particularly being part of sexist and male-dominated sporting codes. There's some research to suggest it also depends on the club. So I remember working with the National Rugby League and the Australian Football League early in the 2000s in response to a series of alleged sexual assaults. And what was clear was that clubs differed in the kind of degree of sexism and the kind of culture they had at clubs. There were some clubs where there were strong cultures of sexual boasting, of heavy alcohol use, of kind of scoring with groupies, cultures of sexual harassment and sexual assault. And there were other cultures where those things were unthinkable, where it was taken for granted that you would never behave in that way. And, there was a sense of a kind of respect and community around female partners, female fans, female players, and so on. And so we certainly shouldn't throw out sport altogether. What we want to throw out is the bathwater of sexism and violent supportive cultures in sport, but we want to hang on to some of the positives of sport. I think where it gets tricky is where the sport itself involves violence. I think, for example, of MMA, mixed martial arts. I think of rugby league or other sports where physically overpowering and dominating your opponent or your opposing team is built into the sport. It's harder to argue, I think, that people can participate in those sports in ways that might not also seep out into their everyday treatment of other people.
Yeah, I guess coaches would play a really big role on what the culture's actually happening in that behind the scenes aspect. Like, how do they talk about women and girls, and how do they talk about themselves and weaker boys, other boys they know in school who don't participate?
Yeah, coaches can play an instrumental role. And in fact, there's some promising violence prevention initiatives that engage coaches. There's a program in the US called Coaching Boys into Men, which has been adopted for the Australian context. And it essentially involves coaches giving short motivational speeches to their players each week about sexual consent, about respect, about gender equity, and so on. And of course, coaches not reinforcing sexism and condoning violence in the way that some coaches historically have. So I think coaches can play a role. I think sporting codes themselves have a role to play in trying to build respectful and gender equitable cultures for their players, for their fans, and so on.
So I'm guessing these are reinforcement of the positives rather than just don't do this, don't do that, etc.
Yeah, exactly. Look, punitive and negatively faced campaigns are rarely effective. What's much more effective is to not only, tell people what they shouldn't do, but tell people what they should, and actually explicitly model the kind of positive or healthy behaviors that you have in mind and explain them in very accessible ways. That's true whether you're trying to teach 13-year-olds in a high school classroom about sexual consent, or whether you're trying to teach adults about what healthy relationships and the healthy resolution of conflicts in a relationship looks like, and so on.
The typical masculine image that we seem to have thrown at us, from all walks of life is the sports hero, the bachelor, the international man of mystery. And all of these successful men are surrounded by women in their early 20s. They've got model looks, and it's both inside and outside of the sex trade that these images are shown. And it normalizes this idea of paying women to degrade, parade, serve and cater to men, and pretty much abase themselves in that service of men. And the man's ego is centered, and it's a very alluring image if you don't acknowledge the woman's humanity. And the second you do identify with the woman's humanity, that successful image just crumbles in front of you. But both men and women have been taught from birth not to look past the man's centering and what he sees and experiences. How can we break this down for particularly boys and girls, but also, adults, men and women? How can we break this down to start pushing that image out and replacing it with something healthier?
That's a great description of what is such a common cultural norm. In fact, such a common cultural norm that I think many people are unaware of it. One of the best examples of that cultural norm is in movies and TV, where the vast majority of movies fail the Bechdel test. That is, they fail the test of having...
Is it two female characters who are named, who speak to one another about anything that is not a man for, I think it's something like 3 minutes?
Or, yeah, at any point in the movie. And most
Yeah.
movies fail the Bechdel test because the central characters are male, the action is driven by men, and to the extent that there are women visible at all, they're there as prizes or sexual objects or ways to earn status. And that's true in so many mainstream movies. And I think you've made a really powerful connection between that and the sex trade and the ways in which women are positioned in that, and the way in which men learn to see women in that. And so I think Therefore, one powerful way, I think one possible way to try to break down those kind of deeply patriarchal norms is to center women's voices and women's action such that women are shown as more than sexual objects or prizes for men, but are shown as, literally people in their own right, shown as actors or agents of change or agents of the plot and so on. And we are seeing some small shift in mainstream media towards that. And in fact, there's some research to show that growing numbers of young men are receptive to media representations in which women are shown as human rather than as, decorative or sexual objects. At the same time, we also have powerful and popular influencers like Andrew Tate, and certainly Andrew Tate and other traditional patriarchal influencers very strongly encourage the message that to be a real man is to be surrounded by attractive women, to kind of get the babes, to, achieve sexual status among women, as well as physical strength and financial wealth. And so Andrew Tate appeals to some very traditional images of dominant or patriarchal masculinity. Some men online who are attracted to Andrew Tate, they find themselves attracted because of his messages, for example, of self-improvement. But those messages of self-improvement are a kind of Trojan horse to smuggle in really deeply sexist messages about what being a man is and about what improvement looks like. So I think we need to, back to your question, how do we challenge this? I think we need to continue to shift media representations and continue to center and platform women and women's voices, whether in fiction or in other forms of culture in our media. I think we need to challenge influencers and the kind of sexist models of self-improvement that they offer. And I think we need to offer to men and boys much more substantive and robust models of what a healthy masculinity or a healthy personhood or way of being in the world is. Indeed, one that they're more likely to achieve, because the vast majority of men are unlikely to be able to drive some $300,000 sports car, be surrounded by supermodels and so on. That's, not only is it unrealistic, but it's harmful, and that's more the problem. But we need to offer to men and boys positive images of how to be in the world that are not only realistic, but far more ethical and equitable.
And I think one of the reasons that Andrew Tate was so popular is because there's like this gap, where young men are looking at who is the role models, and, their own parents are often very busy. And in comes this guy says, I've got all the answers, just pass over a lot of money and you too will get all of this. And it's a very manipulative draw card, but he's also getting them at a very vulnerable time. I think there's also a lot of fathers who don't know how different it is for their sons than it was for them, because the online world has just changed growing up dramatically.
I mean, you mentioned fathers, and I think fathers in particular and parents in general can play a role in making more visible women's achievements and women's work and inviting, particularly their sons, but their children more generally, to, respect and value women's humanity. And that means, for example, with older boys who are starting to date, for example, is having conversations about respectful and gender equitable ways to treat girls if they're attracted to girls or guys.
We want to take a brief moment to thank you for your listenership. As an independent volunteer collective, our episodes are only made possible because of donations from people like you. Please visit our website, www.redlightexposé.com, and click the donate button. Your support is greatly appreciated. And now, back to the episode.
Now, going into the sex trade and having a look at male voices in the Nordic model specifically, I was at a conference once, and it was actually a woman who stood up and said, we've really got to get more men speaking. We need to center male voices. And as a survivor of prostitution abuse, I just bristled at this, instantly, because I'm like, okay, I saw this happen with the decriminalization movement, where it was actually women in prostitution who just wanted to decriminalize themselves, basically. And then along comes the male voice, and it started representing the pimps to decriminalize them. And that's what happened with decriminalization movement. And so I saw this coming into the Nordic model, and I'm like, absolutely not. But I do see that there's a male voice in there, and I'm wondering, how we go about saying, okay, this matters. We want to know what's happening to porn addicts. We want to know what's happening in terms of gay male porn that's going on and men in prostitution. But we also want to protect survivor-led voices and women's voices who are the majority in this. And I'm wondering if you've got any ideas of how we can open the space, but only so much.
It is really tricky. And, I think, for example, of the field of work addressing men's violence against women or domestic and sexual violence more broadly. And that was a field of work very much pioneered by women, by feminist advocates, and is focused particularly on the violence that is perpetrated against women and girls by men and boys. And in that field, certainly I and others have argued for the need to engage men in preventing and reducing men's violence, overwhelmingly because that violence is perpetrated overwhelmingly by men and because we need to shift the models of masculinity that feed into the violence that some men perpetrate. But there's a risk in doing that. There's a risk that in platforming men and emphasizing the need to engage men, we actually push aside women's voices and women's leadership. And if we don't hold those men to a high standard and make sure that those men are working in accountable ways, that is accountable to victim survivors and other feminist advocates in that work, they may end up taking over in ways that aren't helpful. They may end up setting directions for this work that are dangerous and so on. I haven't seen that happen in Australia, but certainly in some contexts internationally, programs that used to focus on work with women and girls have said they're now under pressure to include men and boys, and kind of women only and women focused work has been pushed aside. Now, I think that's very troubling. I don't think that's desirable at all. So while I've been a cheerleader for engaging men in preventing violence against women, I think that needs to happen alongside women only and women focused work. So in relation to the sex industry, I think it's really tricky. You talk about men's voices, and obviously, well, which men's voices? Presumably, we don't want to hear from the men who want to defend men's sexual exploitation of women, who want to normalize it or make invisible the routine harm and exploitation that are part of those systems. We might, on the other hand, want to platform those men who are victim survivors of the sex industry, as, for example, prostitutes or sex workers themselves, or who are reformed sex buyers, that is, men who can reflect critically on their own experience in buying sex and the harm and exploitation that involved, both for the women, but perhaps also for themselves. I would be dismayed if those voices among men were only framed in terms of addiction. To the extent that we do see men speaking critically about pornography in Australia, it's often in terms of addiction. I became addicted and it was harmful for my sex life and my relationship with my partner. Now, I agree that addiction is a form of harm we should pay attention to, but I'm far less concerned about porn making it hard for men to get erections, and far more concerned about porn feeding into men's sexual violence against women, men using erections or their bodies more generally to harm women. And so I think to the extent that we focus on men's voices in relation to porn, in relation to prostitution, ideally they're critical, they're strongly feminist, and they're done in partnership with feminist advocates in that work.
So it's kind of like when you've got somebody talking about, sex addiction or porn addiction, it would be really nice if they could, segue into talking about you don't know who you're actually like getting off to. That person could be a trafficking victim. They could have been coerced. They may have entered by choice, but then found their choice is very limited once there and to be stuck in that situation. They may have had their boundaries pushed out of financial need. So there's a lot of different things that go on. And I think a lot of men wouldn't find it particularly attractive if they knew the stories behind it. I do agree we need to have that voice in there with a more rounded understanding of what's really happening.
I think it could be powerful. It could be a powerful form of advocacy or a powerful part of a communications campaign to have men speaking critically about what it might mean to, pay someone for sex and kind of reflecting on what's fundamentally unethical or exploitative about that. And I think, for example, of, the likelihood that that woman is there, because of constrained conditions and exploitation. I think about trafficking, but I also think about even if I was entirely confident that woman was consenting to her participation in that industry and wasn't being directly harmed in participation in that industry. I think there's still something fundamentally unethical about paying for something that no one should be able to pay for, about gaining access to someone's body, to sexual service by paying cash for it. I think there's something fundamentally kind of disturbing about that. I, for one, would never want to be party to that. And there may be ways to engage men in reflecting on that and speaking on that in ways that might shift the views of other men.
Yeah, I like Melissa Parley's research of across 9 countries. She found that it didn't matter why women entered. 68% came out with some form of post-traumatic stress disorder that emerged either during or after having been in prostitution or pornography. And that's a very powerful and telling statistic that, yes, this is damaging, even when the person themselves says, oh, no, I'm fine.
But I was going to say it's clearly an enormous challenge because, from what I've read, if you look at the kind of punter forums, the kind of online forums where men discuss their experiences of paying women for sex and their experience as the clients of prostitutes or sex workers, there's clearly large numbers of men who are perfectly comfortable with humiliation, with degradation, with exploitation, and so on. So they're not going to care very much, unfortunately, if you can point out that, look, these women are being harmed because, in fact, these men are harming them directly and getting off on doing so. Find subordination arousing, find exploitation arousing. So there's a whole bigger project we need to do of building empathy among men and, above all, challenging male sexual entitlement, challenging, I think, the willingness that too many men have to feel like women owe them sex and they have a right of access to women's bodies.
So there was a small cohort of men when I was in prostitution in New Zealand where you would actually play down to that stereotype of, well, I'm going to use the words, the slut, the whore, because that's what they wanted. They wanted to feel superior to the person they were, paying for. And we openly talked about it. And so it was a role that you'd play in order to get that work. And this was on the streets, in brothels, escort agencies. It was very openly talked about. So you're right, there are men who get off on the humiliation and the degradation, and that's actually what they're paying for. But there are a lot that delude themselves into believing that they're a nice guy, that this behavior of paying somebody isn't doing any harm. They actually fully believe that.
We can get to those men. It'll be harder to get to the men who are invested in subordination and degradation and find that arousing. I mean, I still think there's ways to shift those men as well, but it may take punitive and legal measures rather than, a nice advertising campaign.
Yeah, and I think that's men's work, to be honest. I don't think that that's women's work to do, and I don't think women would get through to those men. While we're on this subject of porn, sissy porn is a debasement as feminization, or feminization as debasement. And feminists have long observed that this debasement is kind of a reflection of what some men think of women, that being female is humiliating. It's tied to homophobia, where the recipient in sex is considered weaker, to be dominated, and thus the so-called feminine partner. And I say feminine with inverted quotes around it. So just wondering how on the online world, easily accessible porn has affected masculinity, and conversely, how masculinity has affected the porn industry, and in particular, the sissy porn aspect.
I'd say pornography has become a very significant sexual socializer for boys and men in general, not just for boys and young men, but for men in general, including older. So when I say a sexual socializer, what I mean is that pornography has a significant influence on boys and men's sexual attitudes and sexual behaviors, their sexual relations with women and girls, and indeed other men and boys. And there's just so much evidence of that. There's so much evidence that pornography feeds into sexual violence. It feeds into sexual violence through the kind of ways of seeing girls and women that it encourages, the sexual scripts it encourages about what sex is and how you should have sex, and in particular through its eroticizing, its making sexy of coerced and degrading and hostile forms of sexual behavior. And I think, in fact, pornography's content has got significantly worse in those ways. That if we look at the content of widely available, widely consumed forms of porn, then intrinsically violent acts such as choking or strangulation, behaviors such as slapping, verbally abusive language, and other forms of harmful, hostile, and degrading behavior are now absolutely routine in porn. And they're shaping the ways in which male users of porn then treat the women and girls around them. And certainly, that's visible in young women's reports of, massively increased reports of coerced anal sex, of being strangled without their consent, and so on. So I think pornography has become a powerful sexual socializer, particularly for boys and men, but also for girls and women. Not in the same way. It doesn't feed to anything like the same extent into sexual violence by girls and women, but it feeds into a certain kind of adopting a kind of pornified sexuality in which you understand your sexuality primarily in terms of its value to male partners, and in which women learn to kind of take on the kind of narratives and ways of being that pornography offers to them, which are sexist and rigid and very narrow models of being. I know less about sissy porn, although I know of it, so I can't comment particularly on that. But I'd certainly say that the kinds of porn that are routinely consumed by, in fact, large numbers of men and boys feed in powerful ways into sexual violence perpetration. And while I said earlier in this podcast that there's been an overall shift towards gender equality, including among men and boys in Australia, we've also seen an uptick in misogyny, more kind of overtly hostile and sexualized misogyny among some boys and young men. We don't have good data, but certainly female teachers, female students, and others report increases in boys and men, saying, make me a sandwich, bitch, or using sexual, explicit and misogynist language and so on. And I think, maybe the Andrew Tates of the world are shaping that, but I certainly think porn is one influence shaping that as well. So there's both positive and negative trends, and certainly one thing fueling negative trends among men and boys is, I think, porn.
One of the sad things that I've noticed online with younger feminists, and just younger women generally, whether they're feminists or not, actually, is I've heard it often said, well, they're just going to do a lot of things I don't like anyway. I may as well get paid for it. And this is why they're turning to OnlyFans and to prostitution, because they're not getting enjoyment out of it. It's not a mutual activity. It's a power game, and in some cases, a violence that is being done to them. And that's made me really sad because it never used to be like that just one generation ago. And that's very much the online world that seems to have fueled this. Like, as a parent, how do you protect your kids from that element online when they've got these devices in their pockets and can access it, or their friends can access and just go, hey, look at this. It's that easy now.
So I think with younger children, there are strategies of regulation or filtering or, parental controls that I think are appropriate. But with older children, as they move into their, their mid-teenage years, those forms of parental control, I think, are too heavy-handed. At the same time, though, we do have to assume that our sons and daughters, our other kids will encounter porn, and we have to make it more likely that they will recognize and be critical of its sexism and its misogyny. In other words, we have to kind of inoculate them against the sexism and misogyny that's routine in porn. And we can do that through conversations about the kinds of things that our kids are likely to see, the problems with the way that sex and women and so on are often represented in porn. We can offer alternative narratives about what sex is, about what relationships are, about what women are and are valuable for, and so on. So I think there are ways for parents to have conversations with our kids that make it less likely that porn will determine their own sexual lives and relations. However, it's not simply down to parents. Social media platforms have an obligation, I would hope a legal obligation and an ethical obligation to take action to make it less likely that minors will see porn, or indeed that sexist and violent porn is available routinely on their platforms. I think federal governments have a role to play, and so on. So I'm interested in not only in educational strategies that parents can adopt, that schools can adopt through education about porn, but also technological and regulatory strategies that social media platforms and governments can and should adopt.
I agree with that. Some of the things you can see on social media today, they just should not be there. I've seen like porn on, formerly called Twitter, currently called X. I don't know if it's still there, but I'm guessing it would be. I can't see it changing unless it's forced to change. When I was consulting on the Nordic model of prostitution in the UK, I came across a really interesting statistic that said only 1 in 5 men have actually used women in prostitution, but most men think that all men do this. And so they don't challenge it because they think they're the unusual one when they're actually in the majority. This needs to be challenged for starters, but I also wonder, how would it change if men knew that most men don't do this?
Yeah, really good question. I remember looking at the data in the early 2000s, and there was data from 2003. I don't know if there's more recent data, but at that point, 85% of adult men in Australia had never paid for sex. 15% had, 85% hadn't. And the numbers varied in different countries. There's some countries, I think, such as Vietnam, where literally a majority of men had paid for sex, and it was kind of culturally normative. In fact, as the way that one often first had sex, your uncle or your father would take you off to the brothel, which I find a very depressing prospect. But there's a well documented phenomena around sexism and violence where men often overestimate other men's tolerance for that behavior or involvement in that behavior. And the kind of classic example is there's 6 men at the pub, and one of those men makes a sexist joke or a rape joke. She's asking to be raped or whatever. Probably 4 of those 6 men don't agree with that and think that's bullshit. No one asks to be raped, or, you're blaming the victim. But none of those 4 men speak up, and every single one of those 4 men thinks they're the only one of the 6 that thinks that. Meanwhile, the man who's made the joke mistakenly assumes that he's in the majority because no one has questioned it. And so he assumes that everyone agrees with him, and probably the one other man of the 6 who does agree with him also thinks that they're in the majority. So men often overestimate other men's sexist and violent supportive attitudes and behaviors. And one powerful strategy for diminishing that is by publicizing the actual rates of the behavior or the actual extent of the attitude. So in this case, publicizing that most men have never and wouldn't ever pay for sex is, I think, powerful. I wish it were fewer than 15%, but I think that could be motivating in some ways, as well as pointing out the harms associated with the industry and trying to pull apart some of the myths that you've been talking about too, the kind of happy hooker myth or other, I think, myths that obscure the exploitation and coercion that is routine in the industry.
Yeah, that happy hooker myth is a real hard one because women in the industry have to play that role. They're being paid to play that role. And I've had conversations with men on, social media where they've openly said they're a sex buyer. And I've said, you realize you're paying her to pretend to like you. And they're like, oh, no, she really does, though.
Yeah, she really does. She's special, or we have a special thing. It's just
They think they're different and special and that, "Oh, yeah, that's other guys." It's like, "No, that's you."
one thing that's going on is the way that men in general are socialized into kind of decontextualized and impersonal sex and socialized into really low levels of emotional literacy, desperate kind of loneliness or need for affection. Because the reason I hesitate is because I don't want to offer a story that is only about, poor men, look at how much they suffer in paying someone for sex, because clearly they're perpetrating harm and large numbers of those men are complicit in or actively reinforcing that harm. So I think a narrative of harms to men is risky as well. But there's clearly something going on there too about this kind of really bizarre and unhealthy mentalities that men must have to be able to think of this as somehow, mutually rewarding.
Yeah, there's 2 myths that seem to just refuse to die about the men who buy, and that is that they're lonely or they're disabled. And in my experience, they're usually married, they've got kids, they have a job, and they're over the age of 40. That's the most common punter in that, that I've ever seen. And I feel like the reason is because when they've got all that down, they're not desperate. Whereas the guy who's suffering loneliness is like, oh, but at least I'm not desperate enough to pay for it. I think that is actually a barrier to doing that. Whereas the guy who doesn't need to can say, oh, well, I have the money, I want to, and it's a power move. And I think that's where the line may be. I could be wrong. I'm not a researcher. I'm just going by my subjective observation.
And I'm guessing to some extent what might shift men's behavior, male clients or potential clients or punters' behavior. And, we've already identified that there's a range of clients, and there's some who want to kind of kid themselves that this is mutually rewarding, or they have some kind of intimate relationship with the woman in question, some who get off on harm and so on, and different strategies will be necessary for different cohorts of men. I think there's no doubt that in part what we need is culture change to shift the very common norms of sexism and male entitlement that keep this industry alive.
Yeah, and I think that's what feminists kind of identified when they brought forward the Nordic model in Sweden, which was called the equality model at the time, was they said, we need to make it a culture where it's not socially acceptable to go and do this. Whereas it is socially acceptable to be in a financially desperate position and accept the money because of that financial desperation. But it's not socially acceptable to use somebody who needs food as an excuse to access their body. There's a kind of conservative pushback going on at the moment, and we've kind of touched on this a little bit when talking about Andrew Tate. But conservatives claim that young men are being feminized, and they're kind of pushing for this 1950s idealism of masculinity and femininity, and this trad wife imagery. And realistically, it's like 1 decade. It's not traditional at all, but they're holding it up like it's a traditional model. So, are men defaulting to femininity, or are they finding gentle masculinity? Or are they finding new types of masculinities, plural? And does this require women to change?
Well, lots of good questions there. Look, when conservatives claim that men are being feminized, I want to respond in two ways. On the one hand, I want to say, well, not really. I point to the fact that what men are being invited to do is to consider more inclusive, more open ended, more diverse models of how to be a man, where men can stay home and look after small children, or men can work in nursing, or men can, moisturize and wear makeup, or men can have sex with other men and fall in love with them, and so on. So, part of it is saying, look, this is not about feminizing men, it's about opening up the models of masculinity open to men, and that men will benefit from that, benefit in terms of their, their relationships with children, the quality of their relationships with their wives and partners, and so on. So part of my response to conservative claims about young men being feminized is to say, no, they're not. But the other part of my response is to say, I hope so. Yes, good. Let's feminize young men. That is, let's make it more possible for young men and men in general to take on some stereotypically feminine qualities that are desirable qualities, qualities like empathy, qualities like nurturance, qualities like democratic and collective leadership, and so on. I think it'd be great if they were qualities that were much more visible among men and not just among women. So, there are some stereotypical qualities associated with femininity that are positive and that, I'd love to see young men take up. Likewise, there are some stereotypical feminine qualities associated with masculinity, such as strength, such as leadership, such as courage, which I'd love to see more available to women in general, and for which I'd like to see the positive versions of more available. So, for example, think of strength. Strength in some traditional models of masculinity is about power over, is about your ability to dominate, to be top dog. That's a very different model of strength from a model of strength that's about moral courage or inner virtue, your ability to withstand challenge, and so on. So it kind of depends on which version of those traditional models of masculinity we're talking about. But you asked, are men defaulting to femininity instead of finding gentle masculinity? Look, I think there's such a mess of things going on. It's certainly the case that I think men these days are offered quite contradictory models of how to be a man. On the one hand, told respect women, don't be a rapist, don't be creepy. On the other hand, get the girls, be a player, be emotionally expressive, share emotion. On the other, don't be a pussy, don't be wrapped around a finger. So I think, maybe young men in particular, and maybe men more generally, are faced with increasingly contradictory expectations about masculinity and contests between more patriarchal and more equitable models of how to be a man. I certainly think more equitable models are good for women and good for gender non-conforming and gay and bisexual and trans men. They're also better for men themselves. I think there's a compelling argument that patriarchal models of masculinity do give men various forms of unfair privilege, but also limit men's emotional well-being, our relationships, our friendships, and so on. And so I hope more men will gravitate towards more healthy and gender equitable models of masculinity. And you asked if this necessitates women to change. I think, our definitions of masculinity and femininity intersect and are mutually dependent in some ways. Particularly models of masculinity are dependent on being not feminine. And in some ways, that's where we started. So it's a bit of an open question as to what kinds of expectations and social norms we will see for men emerge over the next, decade or two. But I certainly hope they're more gender equitable, more inclusive, less patriarchal than they have been.
I personally really like the Chinese yin yang, their understanding of masculinity and femininity, because they flow into and become the other, and each contains the other. And they say that water, which is the feminine, is actually the strongest of the elements because nothing can actually kill it. If it gets cold, it freezes. It gets hot, it turns into steam. It just transmutes and takes on whatever's happening around it.
In the field of work that I spend a lot of time on, which is the field of work engaging men and boys in building gender equality and addressing violence against women and so on, there's debates over what it is we're trying to promote. Are we trying to promote healthy or positive masculinity on the one hand, or are we in fact trying to promote sort of feminist androgyny and some kind of de-gendered model of healthy personhood or healthy selfhood? So there's writers like John Stoltenberg, who's a US writer, who's a radical feminist writer. He's actually the former partner of Andrea Dworkin, who argues that talking about healthy masculinity is like talking about healthy cancer. So he's very critical of any kind of notion of healthy masculinity and sees any kind of investment in that and a gender binary as necessarily tied to patriarchy. I'm less sure of that. I do think that part of our work should be encouraging men and boys to disinvest in being seen as real men, to kind of care less whether they're seen as men or not. At the same time, I think it'd be premature to abandon those notions. And I think that we should put in front of boys and men visible models of healthy masculinity, because men and boys are still tied to gender or invested in being seen as men. And so we need to provide positive or healthy models of being a man, at least at this point. But look, it's a bigger debate. But yes, certainly notions of androgyny, healthy masculinity, and so on are part of these discussions.
Yeah, actually, I was going to ask you about toxic masculinity because, and that kind of juxtaposes to healthy masculinity. But it's a term that's been around possibly a couple of decades ish. I'm not sure when it first popped up. But it's been long enough now that there's boys who have been raised under this term where they don't understand what's being referred to. They just see it as masculinity is toxic, masculinity is men and boys. That means that I'm toxic if and that's their thinking on that one. And so I'm thinking, well, there's got to be some damage happening as a result of this term that isn't clearly understood. So, how's a better way to talk about masculinity, and how do we differentiate healthy and toxic, but maybe use different language or easier to understand terms?
There certainly is a significant level of pushback or resistance and backlash among men and boys to attention to men's lives and masculinity, to efforts to build gender equality, address violence against women, and so on. And I think the main thing driving that resistance or backlash is actually just discomfort with change. That change is unsettling, change is new, that some men are being challenged on their attitudes and behavior. So, in some ways, that resistance and backlash is the same resistance and backlash you see when white people are challenged on racism or when heterosexual people are challenged on homophobia and so on. But I think part of it too is a reaction to, poor language or ineffective framings of this issue. And I think the phrase toxic masculinity, as you've said, is a good example of that. The phrase is widely misheard as suggesting there's something fundamentally toxic about men or boys. And that's not what the term is meant to mean. The term toxic masculinity is meant to work like the term toxic food. That is, there's lots of kinds of food that are healthy, that are good for you, that are delicious. And then there's some forms of food that are toxic that we should stay away from. The same is true of toxic masculinity. There's lots of expectations about being a man or models of being a man that are good, that are healthy, that are diverse, and so on. But there are some that are toxic, that involve expectations that are harmful for the men and boys who try to live up to them, or harmful for those around them. So I tend not to use the phrase toxic masculinity in my public and educational work because it's so often misheard. But we do need some kind of language or set of terms for describing specific sets of expectations about being a man, specific sets of norms that are harmful. So we could talk about sexist masculinity or patriarchal masculinity or the man box. The man box is a term that's used in Australia for a kind of stereotypical or traditional set of expectations that limit men's own lives. That's why it's called a box, but also limit the lives of those around them. So we need some kind of language to name the fact that there are harms there, harms not only for men and boys, but for those around them.
This box, this is sort of, I think when you're talking to the average boy or man, they haven't thought about masculinity beyond like, I've got these expectations I've got to live up to that are set by the people around me, the culture around me. I need to do this to be accepted, that to be accepted. And that's really about it. They're either killing themselves to be accepted or killing themselves to make a statement in opposition to the fact they can't feel, accepted in that. They want to first look at themselves and masculinity and what the pathway forward is. I think it's different for different age groups. Like it's going to be very different for a senior citizen to look for the very first time back over, 65, 70 years and then go, what kind of man do I want to be now? Compared to a man in his 40s who's a role model professionally or socially for the first time ever to younger men compared to a tween or teenager who's got their life ahead of them. And so, where are the starting points for these different places in life?
Look, it's interesting thinking about older men. I think about my dad, for example, who's in his 80s, and I think about other older men I've spent time with. And one pattern you do see among some older men is that retiring and kind of having the space to reflect on their lives and look back at their lives actually makes them mellow, makes them come to a more kind of relaxed and open ended idea about how they can be in the world or about how men should be. And so there are kind of life stages and life transitions where I think men do have more opportunity or more space to think about their roles and the messages they've got, good and bad, about being about being a man. Another important life transition for younger men is about when they first become a father. In general, in Australia, most men who aspire to be fathers want to be involved fathers. They want to be often different from their fathers or their father's generation, where they were the kind of absent disciplinarian father. Instead, these younger men in Australia want to be involved. They want to be there at the birth. They want to be changing nappies. They want to be playing with their babies and caring for them and sharing the domestic work and care with their partners. And so there's been a shift in men's aspirations. There's been far less shift in men's actual fathering behaviour. And that's not necessarily because men are lazy. It can be about family unfriendly workplace cultures. It can be about the social stigma of involved fathering and so on. But I think that there are opportunities for men across different points in their lives to kind of reflect more critically on the messages they've got about being a man. Certainly boys in schools these days are more likely than older generations of boys to find themselves in a classroom discussion, facilitated by a teacher or facilitated by an external community educator about manhood, about gender roles. Growing numbers of boys and girls and others in schools now go through respectful relationships education, which is about addressing domestic and sexual violence. And ideally, that education looks at gender roles and gender expectations as part of that. So I do think we are in various spaces across Australia and in other countries seeing growing productive and critical reflection about manhood, about the messages about being a man that are part of our culture. Parents have done much more of that work around their daughters, thinking, yes, of course, I want my daughter to be able to kick a footy or go to the moon or run the country. Parents are starting to do a little bit of that with their sons as well, although nowhere near as much. And I think in other spaces as well, we're starting to see, I think, some really productive conversations about being a man.
And the last thing I wanted to ask was just how did you decide we need to start looking at masculinity? Because when you started this work, it was a very rare conversation.
Yeah, look, it wasn't some, profound insight that I always had or something. I came to this through a series of kind of accidents and characteristics. I mean, in my late teens, for example, I kind of wanted to do two things. I wanted to change the world and be a good person. So I had a kind of an ethical and an activist orientation. I had some kind of distance from traditional masculinity. I didn't really want to be a kind of blokey Australian bloke. Didn't kind of sit with me well, although I was also perfectly competent at traditional masculine things like sport. I had girlfriends and so on. But I had some sense of distance from kind of sexist blokey masculinity. For some reason, I did women's studies at university. What was then called women's studies is now called gender studies. So I was exposed to feminist scholarship. I was being called on my sexism by feminist women in the left-wing student group I was in. I was in left-wing student politics, and feminist women were the backbone of that group. And they would point out that, well, hang on, all the men had left the room after the meeting, but the women were cleaning up the tea and coffee mugs. You need to do some of that as well. So I was being called on, various forms of sexism in my relationship, in my everyday life. One transformative experience was I joined a men's group, funnily enough, and it was an anti-sexist men's group. It modeled itself on early women's or feminist consciousness raising groups. So it was all men. About half of us were gay or bisexual. There were other men like me who were heterosexual. We met for 2.5 hours every second Tuesday for about 2 years. And we talked about porn, about violence, about fathering, about body image. So that amongst the other things I've talked about was another kind of transformative experience. And so all these things for me cemented a kind of passion for this area, fascination with this area. And none of this is to say I've learnt it all or I've got it all right. I definitely still stuff up. I definitely still behave in dodgy ways sometimes. I definitely have lots to learn. But I feel incredibly privileged in terms of the benefits that this work and this involvement has had on my own life, my friendships, my relationships, and the communities I'm part of with amazing men, women, and other people. So, yeah, I feel privileged to now, have work and involvements that, express that passion.
Oh, great. That sounds like it would have been one of the very first ever men's groups to be happening.
Look, that was in the late 80s. There've been men's groups really since the beginnings of second wave feminism in the early 1970s. There were anti-sexist men's groups in, cities around Australia and countries across the world. They were always small, they were relatively scattered. But our group, in fact, came out of a pre-existing group that had folded. So alongside what is a very large and sprawling history of feminist activism, there's a small history of pro-feminist activism alongside that.
Oh, that's good to hear. Is it still running?
Not that particular group in which I was involved, but there's certainly organised pro-feminist activism in Australia and in countries across the world. It's far smaller than women's feminist activism, but there are groups, there are networks, including men's anti-pornography and anti-prostitution groups. So there is some men's activism in relation to the sex industry. More of the pro-feminist activism around the world, though, is focused on men's violence against women, including through sort of fairly well-established networks and so on.
Oh, that's good to hear. But if you've got a listener who's never heard anything about this before, what's the main takeaway for them?
If they're a man, I would say think critically about the messages you've received about being a man, good and bad, and how they might have shaped your everyday treatment of women in the bedroom, in the kitchen, on the street, and so on. And think about how you might come to healthier, more equitable, more respectful ways of living in your own life. They'll be good for you and good for those around you.
Oh, thank you for being with us for this hour. It's been great.
Great to chat.
We hope you found this episode informative. To follow us on social media, click the links in the show notes below. If there is a topic you would like us to cover, you can contact us at redlightexposé.podcast@gmail.com or head on over to our website, redlightexposé.com. There you can also find a donation page if you'd like to support the show. All the hosts at Red Light Exposé are volunteers, so we rely on your donations to continue to compensate our survivor guests and cover operative costs. Thank you for listening. We hope you tune in next time.